So, welcome to Ideamarket podcast. I am joined once again by Mike Elias, CEO of Ideamarket, and we are joined by Michael Garfield, who is the host of Future Fossils and the Complexity podcast, or hashtag Complexity podcast, if you can find that, and hashtag Future Fossils, find that. Also, a context provider, a Rift navigator, and a novelty engine. Was this is what I've taken from your biography from Twitter, which is three sort of fairly very open things going on there. But instead of sort of asking the general introduce yourself question, we have a little bit of a different question here on Ideamarket podcast. If, Michael, you were to develop a course, and the purpose of this course is to teach everyone, educate everyone who takes it to become as close to your way of thinking as possible, what would this course look like?
It would be, I was nailed a few years ago by art professor Michael Schwartz, who said that what I do is creative deconstruction. So I feel like what I'm especially good at is in a boring way described as lateral thinking, but I regard it as more a way of kind of jimmying people out of their cognitive ruts. Like I used to be obsessed with these PBS Nova dinosaur documentaries, and there was always this scene in the documentary where someone would get their field vehicle stuck out in the Badlands of Mongolia or whatever, and they would have to get under it with planks and kind of like crank the car out of this puddle. And, I think that I just have such delightful irreverence. I was about to say disrespect for these conceptual categories as sort of like fixed ontological things, like art, science, and religion, like that sort of trinity. People defend and people aggressively police the boundaries of these three ideas. And what I like to do is show people how to kind of turn this hyperdimensional object so that you're looking through the prism, so that what people are calling science is an art, or what people are calling religion is a science, etc. And you can, obviously those are just three things. Like take anything. For me, it's about teaching people how to hotwire their own mind so that you can, you basically, like, it's a meta programming thing. Like, Lakoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By, which was like one of my most important formative books, makes the case that the metaphor is this sort of ultimate super tool. And we just take for granted when someone says, oh, it is this. It's like, oh, well, it is or is not. And it's like, well, actually, is a really powerful tool in reconstructing our relationships to the undivided whole cloth of our experience. And so, most of my writing and the book that I'm currently in the process of revising for Metanoia Press, Richard Doyle's imprint, is all about this, where it's like the future is this, and every section is, there I go doing it again and just assuming but yeah, that kind of thing, that, using metaphorical associations and entailments as flexible operators so that we can see things in fresh ways. That's what I would teach people.
That's awesome, and it makes perfect sense. I enjoy this theme in general, just the amount of value that can be unlocked just by applying a different metaphor to the same set of concepts. We really do get entrenched in metaphors like their infrastructure. Like, if the highway doesn't go there, you just can't go there. But we have way more control over that than convention would suggest. So I think that's really cool and a pretty exciting answer. I'm interested in, do you have any favorite favorite metaphors or favorite like reframes of things that are commonly mismetaphored?
Well, being someone who relishes my time-space synesthesia, I think most people take for granted that time is spatial. And I love thinking about time in spatial metaphor, but from a remove, from the kind of remove that we're talking about here, where we realize that it's just a conceptual tool. So, I mean, it turns out actually like that's not as common as I thought it was. For instance, like
Which part? The reframing in general is
well,
not as common?
like thinking of time in a spatial sense. Like we use calendars, like we tend to lay things out in that way. But it turns out that, or last I read, something like only 1 in 50 people actually have a persistent geometry in their imagination when they think about time. Like for me, it's sort of, this annual wheel has a very sort of specific orientation. Like I'm standing here in September and then I'm like looking across this atrium to February, diametrically. And, as it's like a rotating restaurant on top of a building or something. So, that's kind of the, what I inhabit. I saw recently this company in Boulder tried to patent using a fractal helix to represent time. And I lost my mind on them. I was like, you can't, like, I am seriously opposed to the enclosure of these kinds of conceptual terrains through, like with commerce. And I went and I found all of these, all the prior art to bust their patent case. Cause I was like, you can't do that. That's not fair. This is like, this is not the king's forest. Okay. Like we all get to forage here. But yeah, I mean, that's not like especially, amazing, but I do think that there's, once you get into playing with the idea that this is really just a metaphor and that we don't really know what time is in that sense, because people confuse mathematical dimensions, which are conceptual, with like physical dimensions. And I think even physicists probably do this. Like, I'm actually not convinced that space is extension in the way that we think of it, and I think it's much more about like the organization of it, our sensorium into something, that we can, it's more like data compression or something. And it's not necessarily like we move through space, because if for the same reason that people critique the idea that we move through time. But at any rate, that's, I don't know if we wanted to go there right away.
We've gone deep. We're in deep already.
Yes, we have about 2 hours left to record. And by that, I mean about 11 meters. And we can.
One thing that's interesting there, you talk about this patenting of this company. So you said they wanted to like helix in relation to time?
Yeah, they wanted to patent the visualization of time as a helix.
Okay. Well, it just made me think of Infinite Jest, where the time frame and all the years are sponsored, right? And it's like 1991, whatever year of the adult. I think the first year is like the year of the adult undergarment, like the incontinent adult undergarment, and all years are sponsored. So like, if we said the date now, we'd have to be like, yeah, it's the letter. What is it today? 13th of September, 2021, the year of the miniature Mars bar or something. I always loved that because I thought, to be fair, I don't think we're that far away from that. Someone like a company is powerful enough to go, yeah, we're sponsored the date. Like, and all the kids in school have to write that as the date. but I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a strange tangent to go on, but how can you, why did that frustrate you so much that they wanted to patent the visualization of time?
Well, I mean, I think to the extent that people listening to this show are self-selected, more likely to be people who believe in open source, then, for me, it comes down to this fantastic, yes, you're all geniuses. But no, I mean, in all likelihood, you're listening to this, and so you are fed up with the corporate enclosure of, the successive enclosure of more and more sort of abstract terrains of experience. And, I think a lot of this came out of my reading Lewis Hyde's book, Common as Error, which is a history of intellectual property. And, he talks about the first enclosure being the enclosure of geography, of physical land. The second enclosure being the enclosure of ideas. And then the third enclosure, which is something that's happened basically over the course of our lives, is being able to patent something for which there is no known utility, which is basically speculative patenting. And that's the majority of, like Monsanto patenting a significant fraction of the human genome, for instance, just because they have the legal authority, like the legal power to do this. And so, this is the enclosure of the future. It's the enclosure of things that we don't yet understand. And that really just gets under my skin because, I mean, this is sort of like related to this other issue, which is that, profit is something that I hold, because I work in science communication for the Santa Fe Institute. And I spend a lot of time hanging out with these and listening to these economists who are trying to make formal mathematical models that hew closer to the actual dynamics of systems. So, like, SFI was largely responsible for moving economics out of this sort of equilibrium idea, that everything is seeking a balance. It's like, well, not really. It's an open system. Sunlight comes in, things build order out of available free energy and export disorder. And then in that system, all of these different players have strategies that they're constantly adapting to the ever shifting strategies of everyone else. So it's never actually going to find that balance. And, so like this kind of thinking, also, a critique of the idea of the sort of self-serving rational agent, because there's a fundamental uncertainty. None of us actually have perfect information about the world that we're inhabiting. And so none of us are capable of making the kind of decisions that most economics models are still talking about people making today. And so, in this, stewing in this community of minds, as I have, one of the things that's become really obvious to me is that all economic models are themselves evolutionary products, that they're a hypothesis in the same way that your body can kind of be seen as a hypothesis. It's an encoding of stable environmental features as a way of, like, reducing uncertainty, not just for you, but like for the ecosystem in which that you inhabit. And so an economic model is by necessity leaving something out, in the same way that a machine learning algorithm is always going to overfit its training data. And so that means that, like, basically economic models that are lean, that are are sort of like parsimonious as possible, and this has been the case for, basically all of the modern world, that we're optimizing for profit and therefore also optimizing for externalities. And so, like, to the extent that we, to the extent that we try to like cut something over here, we're creating all of these unintended consequences. And of course, like it, trying to like contain and understand everything doesn't make that any better. You actually generate more externalities, going on the, taking things to the opposite pole as well. But the point is that like, it's really hard for me now to like, I can't think any other way except that basically any attempt that we make to model value in an economy, by which I include like the ecosystem that underlies that economy, right? Like the whole conversation around ecosystem services is fraught for this reason, because we don't actually know everything that an acre of rainforest is doing. And so if we try to like financialize that acre as a way of like respecting its contributions to the human economy, then we continue to undermine ourselves by intentionally on some level ignoring everything else that it's doing that we don't yet realize. And so like this, when it comes to like, sorry for this like huge thing, but like the point is that like we enclose the future by doing this, and this, I'm really kind of agnostic as far as value creation is concerned for these reasons. I think that like Cory Doctorow has written really excellently about his critiques of terra nullius, with this notion that somebody is creating value whole cloth out of raw materials, which is very much a colonialist way of thinking. Oh, this continent is uninhabited except by everybody that already lives here. And I feel that way about the future, and Future Fossils is largely about trying to sort of restore a dialogue with and an awareness of everything that we don't already recognize that we're in conversation with, and so yeah, it just really, really pisses me off when when people are just like, profit maximizers that are like, oh, here's something that no one has planted a flag in yet, so we're going to pretend that we came up with it. And it's like, bullshit, you did. Actually, ironically, Kevin Kelly wrote a really, I think, another really solid critique of this in his book, What Technology Wants, which for all the things I might object to about that book, like he's got a great chapter in simultaneous co-discovery, talking about how like the inventor is actually part of this ecosystem and everyone's kind of standing at the edge of the same adjacencies, and so it's just, really the people that we regard and reward as innovative heroes of history are just the people that were like standing on the backs of enough other people that they could reach this thing that many, many other people could see at the same time. And so we need to come up with, I think that this is kind of where it lines up with the work that y'all are doing, because, we need to find a better way to understand and reward individual contributions in terms of, the production of, or the extraction of knowledge.
There's a really interesting point from that, right? That something it made me think about, and I'm not sure if this is entirely true. I remember there was a big hoo-ha about it a few years ago when it first was in the news, that certain companies, the two most notable ones were Facebook and Cadbury's, who do the chocolate. They have apparently copyrighted so there's a Facebook blue and Cadbury's purple, right? That's like their color, right? Like no one can use it. Like they own a color. And I remember thinking back then, I was like, you've just cracked open like 1,000 different philosophical problems. Like, so somehow, Merleau-Ponty writes 800 page philosophical tome on whether or not there can even be like the phenomenology of color. And Cadbury's is like, yeah, They can, and we and we own it. So I feel like immediately as they, like as immediately as you do that, not only are you like claiming this ownership, but you're also like immediately destroying a ton of questioning and horizons, right? You're like, we don't care about the horizon. Like, no, we own it. You don't get to do anything anymore. And there's no more questioning. You say, oh, well, I guess we just got to deal with that now. Right. And it's such a weird predicament to be in, because it seems so simple to say, well, hang on, like, what is a color? Like, what have you, I don't really understand what you've done. You know what I mean? And then this whole horizon, as I said, is just sort of cut off. I don't really know where I was going from that, but it did just make me think of that, because I think Coca-Cola as well might have done it, that these colors are so famous that there was actually it's quite depressing, but there is somewhere a chart of, can you name these brands? And it's blocks of color. And it makes you realize like what the advertising world has done to your brain, right? You see the purple, you're like, man, that's Cadbury's. And you think, oh God, like my brain's been absolutely fried by marketers.
And you know, by the same extent, like I remember reading this thing about how people who are really, really good at recognizing makes and models of cars, it's the same part of your brain that's responsible for facial recognition. And so those people have sort of like filled that part of their brain. They've trained that network on cars, and they have a harder time recognizing individual faces because they've tuned it in that direction. And so, yeah, I mean, we live in this next nature to point to that Dutch organization, nextnature.net, which is, exploring this really dicey, bizarre terrain. The next nature, like their whole thing is their like wallpaper are all of the brand logos that are animals. And so, you realize that to your point, like we recognize all of these things. We are still using the same part of our brain that was responsible for navigating a biodiverse landscape. And it's now that diversity has been sort of like uploaded into corporate IP space. And, now when I walk around my neighborhood, I'm really trying to sort of restore the topsoil of my own mind and like backfill this by going around with Google Lens, because there's no abuela here to teach me about all the local herbs, so I'm using plant ID software to say, okay, like what are the medicinal plants growing in my yard? And like, that's that's the most that I can do. But like, I mean, it's, it's so funny. It's like, well, of course we recognize all these different colors because, like if you go to talk to somebody who grew up in the rainforest in like an uncontacted tribe, our brains are doing the same thing their brains are doing. We're just, adapting to the stable features of a built environment, except now humans are the ones building it. And maybe not even humans. Like I'm kind of into this eldritch thing about how, the social and the institutional has actually been in charge, has been like the dominant causal force of humankind since we started, since what we would recognize as human beings first appears in the fossil record, that like we're human because we're like living in these superorganisms. But it's getting out of hand.
The Facebook blue thing makes me want to see if there's anyone listening to this who has the ability to make Facebook blue colored glasses that we can just buy and turn everything Facebook blue and just see if they do anything about it. I think that would be a hilarious lawsuit to be on the receiving end of.
Do you think their legal team ever like looks up on a sunny day and is like checking the sky, and if it gets a certain shade of blue, they're like, right, that's it, man.
Yeah, send up more pollutants. Right, yeah.
Or the sea.
Well, in 2013, Disney tried to trademark Dia de los Muertos because they were the film that eventually became Coco was going to be called Dia de los Muertos, and so they were trying to get ahead and like, set up all the IP for all the merchandise. And the Hispanic community completely jumped on their asses about it And actually, it's a beautiful thing. This is a weird sort of twisted thing to have hope in, but I do see that like we do have to strike a balance with these super predators that we've created and now live underfoot with, and Disney to realizing that they were undermining their own profit seeking motive by enclosing this particular piece of a fiercely defended commons. They ended up bringing all these cultural consultants onto the film and ended up making what I consider to be like the most respectful piece of Disney cinema that has ever been made. And then it went on to become the number one highest grossing film in Mexico of all time. And so, I mean, I look at that and I think there is a way to find a, to find a sort of mutual relationship where people see Coco in Mexico and they think people are watching this in China and they're learning about our culture, and Disney has not like planted a flag in us in a way that we take issue with, and it's just like, I think that particular balance is something that merits much, much more exploration, and is something that I imagine, to the extent that, massive corporations like that continue to exist, which I think they will. I'm not a, an ideologue maximalist as far as decentralization is concerned. Trees and mycelia live in balance with each other, right? And so like there's this question for me, which is like, how do corporations find a way to sell us back to ourselves without like actually stealing from us? And I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, that seems like an interesting case study.
I want to bring it back to time in that way, because I think you're pointing in a really interesting direction. And it makes me think of, I've been watching Jordan Peterson's Bible lectures, and they're excellent. And one of the things he talks about is the fall from the Garden of Eden is the descent into time. Like we were in this timeless space where every moment is fine and perfect, and God is hanging out next door, and he walks around the garden and you walk around the garden, and it's like there's no calamity or no possibility of calamity. And then when they're sent out of the Garden of Eden, it's basically the awareness that someday they're going to die. There's this future that they have to worry about. There's this finitude that they have to worry about. And that's the world that we're still in. And when we're talking about maximizing profit, I think if we're really super rational about it, maximizing profit does not mean maximizing profit. It means shortening the time frame, like picking an arbitrarily short time frame in which to maximize profit. Because I think really maximizing profit, which is what you might be alluding to a little bit here, involves playing on a time scale that is as close to infinite as we can. Because to the extent that we maximize profit at the expense of blowback that we are creating just out of necessity for the balance of life to restore itself, that's not actually profit maximization. And I think what Disney did with Coco, it sounds like in this frame that you put it in, is play that game on a longer time scale. And I've hypothesized that that's the direction to experiment in when it comes to reconciling profit with benefit.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So for part of last year, I might have been the most briefly employed staffer for the Long Now Foundation. Like I had a 6-month contract for this nonprofit org that thinks about trying to like help people think in a 10,000 year time frame. But like long enough for me to really like internalize a lot of that and honor the inspiration that they've given me in these conversations. And I think, part of what we're talking about here is actually the fact that like with Coco, Disney, the superorganism, the Archon, became aware of its own microbiome or something like that. That the problem is that, that much as we are tuned, in our sensory motor and cognitive capacities to relate to reality at all of these different scales, but like to relate to it primarily through the quote human scale, to focus on things that are like at this level of resolution. So too are governments and businesses and, other, forms of agency. And, that when people say, well, like, oh, the state doesn't care about you. It's like, well, how can it if it doesn't know you exist? And so to this, this problem is, a problem that extends sort of laterally to concerns that I have about the role of artists in society and the fact that artists are just like chronically under-recognized and undercompensated, or for that matter, like visionaries of any kind, like really like the sort of posthumous recognition of, someone who came up with an idea. That's why is that the rule instead of the exception? And it's because the incentive structures of society are misaligned with the incentives of individuals. Yes. I mean, this is like why I'm so glad to be speaking to you on this, right now, because it really is a question of how do we allow, I mean, and honestly, like, I don't know that a lot of people are going to be happy with this answer because it kind of requires deeper surveillance, on one level, right? Like you need to, in order to be seen, you need to allow yourself to be seen. Like in order to be respected and fed, then you have to speak up, or you have to be visible in a way to, like again, with the machine learning stuff, it's like, well, if you don't want, if you're in a, an underrepresented ethnic group that is miscategorized by Google Photos as a gorilla or something, it's because you've been left out of the training data. It's because you're like below the radar, and so you actually have to kind of participate in this thing in a deeper way, in order to get, fair and equitable treatment. And so, I mean, this gets into like questions like the collective action problem of climate change is a really, like clear and an obvious instance where, maybe, what is it going to take for us to care about empirical truth rather than the sort of social truth of, like you speak about this in your documents for this project, that political bias gets in the way of people actually, that we're really, really good at politically motivated innumeracy. And actually, like the cleverer someone is, the better they are at deceiving themselves in this respect. And so you get these things where like people think that they're going to vote one way. Mirta Galassik's research at the Santa Fe Institute was like, why did the Trump victory surprise all the people who were running the polls? And it's because they were asking people who they thought they were going to vote for and not who they thought their friends were going to vote for. And it turns out who your friends are going to vote for is ultimately a greater determinant of your own decision than what your own personal values are. And so like when it comes to, these sort of big abstract issues, on Complexity Podcast, I had a conversation, episode 33 with Tim Kohler and Martin Scheffer, who were looking at climate change and collective action problems. And it's a matter of like, it's a two-way thing. It's like, how do you take these enormous abstract realities and immanentize them at the level of the individual so that they become relevant? But then it's also the case that like, how do you take the concerns and the needs of the individual and make them visible to a corporation or to a government, And I feel like projects like yours are starting to chip away at that predicament and start to understand, like you said, Mike, how do we aggregate information across timescales in a way that better serves the needs of, that are I think probably always going to be in conflict. It's or in tension in some way between individuals and institutions, or between individual species and the ecosystems in which they participate, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I like the way you put it as a tension between those two things as opposed to a conflict, because it seems sort of like there's a potential for a flywheel there once it gets going. Right now, it's a conflict just because it's sort of the best we've been able to do. But once there's the right relationship with, between these two things, there doesn't have to be, I think. And the question of how do we get people to prioritize seeking a better understanding as opposed to a political preference or some other preference that people might have for a panoply of emotional reasons for which they cannot be blamed. Like there's a million reasons that people are completely innocent in this and in general. Those questions, are indeed completely foundational to what Ideamarket is trying to do. And I love that conversation, and I'm just constantly looking for more ways to provoke that kind of curiosity and give people more reasons to prefer curiosity to validation seeking and things like that. So I love that endeavor in its entirety.
One of the, just to bring something in here, one of the immediate problems I see here that we seem to be talking about, just to bring it back to time as well, is this notion of time preference and the problem of time preference on a greater scale between the individual and society. And like the best place I've read about this, obviously it's a controversial book, but Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed, talks about it. That's his argument for why democracy in its current iteration is constantly failing, is because if you give everyone a say, then on a great scale, those say, like, your voice basically is completely dampened out and ends up meaning nothing. So you just target yourself towards the shortest time preference. So it's no longer like, all right, we've got this climate change thing, which is this huge thing, but you end up just doing a short time preference thing. Like, well, I'll just say I want like the potholes filled in the road because like, well, but no one's going to hear my voice anyway. So we need to like, what's the point? Right. So there's this massive problem of basically how can you sell long time preference to people, especially to the extent of, like, trust me, we really need to do this thing, but you're never going to get to see the benefits of it, really. That's a hard sell.
And I love the way you put this, Michael, when you said, how do we immanentize it? I think that's the perfect way to frame that question, that it's not that people aren't aware that things like climate change are a problem. It's that it doesn't feel immediate. It feels like it's someone else's problem. It feels like nothing I do today. It feels like we're doomed.
It's the future. It's the future's problem, right?
Yeah. It feels like we're doomed to a feeling of alienation with regard to solving it. Like no matter how much work I put in today or even the next 10 years, I'm not going to like feel the benefit and be satisfied that I contributed something. And so that problem of immanentizing it, I also really like. And there is also that same problem when it comes to the institution versus individual attention. Scale itself creates this tension. And I think I'm going to kind of reiterate some of the things that you're saying, but I can't help myself because I've been thinking about this a lot. If you have a lemonade stand and someone drinks your lemonade and dies, it changes your life. It breaks your heart. It's like oh my goodness.
Speaking from personal experience?
No, I am not. Thank you for asking for clarity there. I am not. This is pure metaphor.
Weird lawsuit.
Pure metaphor. Here, I'm gonna drink my own lemonade on camera just to prove it. Yeah, I'm good. So, and by the way, it's not lemonade. It's green. Don't write me things later. That's not lemonade. So yeah, if you have a personal relationship with a customer and something goes wrong, you feel it in your heart and it's like an issue. But if you're the CEO of Walmart and someone drinks Walmart's lemonade in Tuscaloosa and they die, it doesn't even reach your desk. Like the man it being measure of all things means that when you scale man up and responsibility, to the head of a global corporation, when that guy scratches his arm, the skin cells that he kills are like tens of people. Like the scale of responsibility going up, it is incomprehensible to a human when you give a human like big responsibility like that. And there's only so much you can do to, tell the CEO to pay better attention or something like that. Like, it's not really a solvable problem at that level. So I really like that idea and the concept of immanentizing consequences and responsibilities. That seems like a really important factor in graduating from this sort of behemoth versus microbe, relationship that corporations and individuals currently enjoy.
Well, I mean, you surface for me a related issue that I think also feeds into this, which is the question of the asymmetry of power in the first place. Like, okay, we can do something to, like you said, it's not perfectly soluble. Like, there's just no way that you can really continue to give somebody that much power without it resulting in violence. And so, like before we were starting this call, we were talking about our guitars on the wall. And I was telling you about how, like, this guitar behind me, I've been, for the first time in, my 20 plus years of writing songs, I felt like, oh, here's a guitar for protest songs. And I got it right around the time that they were having the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests. And, in the last year. And I was thinking a lot about the work of physicist Jeffrey West at the Santa Fe Institute, whom I was interviewing for a Complexity podcast around the same time, and how he talks about, physical scaling laws in society, and how the cardiovascular system of an organism has to branch at more and more points as the organism scales. I forget the exact number, but like a tiny creature like a mouse, from the aorta to the capillaries, there's like maybe 3 branch points. And then in something like an elephant, it's like 9. And so, the number of layers of governance in order to reduce friction has to grow. Like the number of decision branch points, the number of layers at which the decision making is flowing has to grow as something scales. And so, like, this has really shaped my thinking on the whole conversation around defunding the police, because I think what we're really talking about, and I wrote this whole song about it that I'm working on in the studio right now because I'm behind on everything, but because a human being doesn't scale, and we've all taken on more work than we can actually do, and I'm going to have to assign digital clones of myself to finish my opus after my death. But like I've got this song that's about sort of, an argument for fractal anarcho-syndicalism in a biophysical network called We Police Ourselves, which is just about like I was talking with my friend JF Martel, who's the co-host of Weird Studies, this morning, right before that was who I was talking to right when we hopped
Sorry,
on.
did you say Weird Studies?
Weird Studies, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And
that's interesting. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, they're fabulous art and philosophy show. But JF and I were talking about trying to like this balance, like the tension between centralization and decentralization. And I think a lot of people, when they say they want to decentralize something, what they actually mean is they want to distribute the strain of a system that actually does benefit from having some measure, like some kinds of centralization, like an aorta. But like, you don't actually want, like, how do you restore proper boundaries around an individual so that we can stay sane in a networked society, so that we're not taking on too much? But you do it by decentralizing at a different layer. And so like the whole, anyway, this is kind of word salad, but the whole thing with like defunding the police is not just like that function in one form or another. I think is, that's just strongly convergent. Like, that's not going away. It does minimize violence, but the problem is that we're putting all of these responsibilities on police officers that don't belong to them or should not belong to them. Like you should not be calling in a cop to address, a homeless person who's going to lose, who's going to lose it if somebody shows up with guns, or like I worked in as an artist and musician at festivals for years. And, because of the Rave Act in the United States, we have the situation where festivals are accountable for the drug use of people at festivals. And so if someone ends up in an ambulance because they overdosed, then that ends up ruining they're going to be, faced with all of these, legal charges and so on. When in reality, like most of the time that person might just need, Thorazine or a glass of water or a blanket, and I found myself having to act in these roles as like the de facto psychedelic. My friends and I who were, out there at these events were acting as the sort of like underground psychedelic harm reduction team for these events so that it was never escalated to a point where it became visible to a system that has it's like binary. It's like either there isn't a problem or there's a fatal problem, And so, yeah, that's probably where I should stop this rap. But yeah,
no, I mean, the fact that you're putting a lid on yourself makes me wonder what you're tempted to say. But I'm fascinated by that role that you chose to play, and I like the idea of fractalizing kind of responsibility down to the individual level more in that way. And there are two aspects of the crypto worlds that are moving in this direction. Of course, you have DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations that are using cryptographic voting rights and things like that to coordinate without massive centralization of power. And from the kinds of issues you're raising, it strikes me that the need for philosophers in the design space here is extraordinary, because what DAOs are going to do is redistribute power cryptographically, which is going to make that's going to have both upsides and downsides. And the upsides are talked about a lot, that you can be secure, that your position in the network is what the code says it is. You're not just going to be yanked out by some SS officer or something like that. And the downside is there's a certain brittleness. I wouldn't say brittle. There's a certain like rigidity of code that makes it hard to adjust. And yes, you can have communities vote to change things and whatnot. But in the same way that now we are sort of collectively reaping the consequences of all the philosophical nuances we overlooked for practical reasons. And these tiny gaps in our metaphors have become gaping holes, and things are falling into it all the time, like in a disaster movie. When we do that at the cryptographic level, two things are going to happen. One, there's going to be a ton of hope that this is never going to fail and it's perfect. Look, it's all math. And that is going to cause way too much faith to be placed in the philosophical flawlessness of all these new institutions and infrastructures that we're building. So that by the time we realize, oh, I didn't think about that, and now Facebook owns the moon or whatever, there's gonna be some hell to pay. Like for every harmony that philosophically sound design can create now is a crisis that is going to be averted in the future. And so I would be really interested to see what kind of impact your feedback and people who think like you could have on the crypto space.
Well, I'm here for it. If you're listening and you want to onboard a philosophical advisor, then let's talk.
Please hire this guy, like venture capitalists, Andreessen Horowitz. Get your portfolio projects and hire Mike Garfield and make him be the red team on all your projects issues. 'Cause if you're going to take over the world, you better do it well, man. Like we're getting tired of this.
My 1-month-old son is named Ian after Ian Malcolm, who ostensibly was a mathematician at the Santa Fe Institute, and is the sort of, in my mind, the sort of the zenith of fictional red team contribution. I read that book at age 7, and now I have a Jurassic Park tattoo I got at 18. Like that is the frame in which I regard all of these knock-on effects in the modern age. I think that it is actually just minted an NFT of the song I wrote about this, quoting Ian Malcolm at length in the song. I mean, because it is ultimately, I mean, I think there are a number of reasons for us to engage in epistemic humility, right? And it's not just, I mean, I think it's there is actually a clear incentive here. John Keats has this phrase, negative capability, which is, regarding the awareness of one's ignorance as a positive trait, as something that you actually want to like lean into this. And from a complex systems view, I think that it's relatively easy to argue, I think now compared to maybe even just a few years ago, that, when you start seeing companies bringing on more of this kind of like red team stuff, like the BMW group, I hear, has a department of internal disruption, and it's like, well, if you live in a world where the environmental features are inherently unstable, like it's just so much harder for us in the 21st century to tell ourselves a cosmological story in which the world is static. Like you're talking about the fall, like that's a world in which you are going to do the same job as your parents and their parents and the parents, their parents. And that's clearly not the case. It's like in some respects, the generation is now not, the human generation. It's the generation of information technologies. And so, you are sort of your own grandparents in this weird way as you live through these multiple epochs of new structures. And so, in that kind of a space, this is when like Alan Moore, back in what is it, like the 2004 documentary on graphic novelist Alan Moore, where he was talking about society going through this transition from a liquid to a gas, and it's like, I don't think it's a mistake that we talk about like cloud computing, like cloud servers. And at any rate, I think the point is that there is much more now than there was a clear argument and incentive for remaining open in one's strategy and in one's models, and in accepting an inherent and in an unavoidable pluralism of models. Because we're at a point now where, and I'll send you a link for the show notes to this episode I had with the president of SFI on market crashes and mass extinctions, and how like the organisms that survive through these punctuations are generalists. A mature ecosystem develops all these like narrowly specified niches that are really, really brittle against disruptions. And at the same time, you go all the way back to the origins of complex system science with Bob May of the Royal Society in his 1972 paper, Will a Complex System Be Stable? That, he made this mathematical argument that's counterintuitive to a lot of people, which was that basically the more complex something is, the more the more it's likely to disrupt itself catastrophically. And so, like, here we are, global economy, it's like we're living Jurassic Park in the, to the extent that zoonotic diseases and or, escaped gain of function experiments, whatever your story, that we're the landscape of our world now is characterized by these ruptures. It's characterized by the, invasive species and cancers and, autoimmune disorders and, the activity of human beings on our human time scale, leaving geological effects, with like the Anthropocene conversation. So like we have I think, it's easier than it's ever been to pitch the value proposition that we need to keep ourselves open to the unknown and to, the disregarded. And
yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, it seems to be like a notion of like brain plasticity, right? So when I was younger, obviously seeing the internet come into full force, being in that generation which will eventually be rare, where you literally saw 3 or 4 computers in an entire school, and by the end of my schooling, it was like every room was just full of computers. It was like, yeah, this is here to stay, right? So that transition stage of what was maybe 10 years between basically some people using internet for extremely specific purposes to playing flash games with your mates in the computer hall, like really quickly. And I remember thinking, oh, this will be the last time, because I remember then at that young age, seeing old people who are really struggling with it and thinking, well, this will be the last time there's ever really a technological problem or leap like this, because we're now like all completely embedded in this culture. And in time, like right now, I've realized actually that's completely wrong, right? Because I don't think it's anything to do with the actual technology itself, like how the UI is, how you use it, which seems to be what it appears to be, right? Like, what do you mean you don't get how this works? It doesn't seem to be anything to do with that. It seems to be something like deeper and more abstract, to do with the content and what it actually represents in terms of the culture, and whether or not people actually want to like deal with it and apprehend it, right? Because I've basically turned into a real curmudgeon with PC software. People are like, dude, you really need to use this new thing. And I'm like the equivalent now of sort of using a rotary phone, right? I've got the software I like using, even if it takes me an hour longer, I still do that. And it's the same with the NFT things. It's like, I get it, but at the same time, my brain's like, real old man, like, why would they buy a picture of a monkey? I don't understand this. So it seems to be to do with the plasticity of whether or not you can really allow yourself to basically go into that new horizon, right? That seems to be what's keeping people back, is whether or not you're like, okay, right, we need to, something really needs to be remolded to, it's nothing to do with this like empirical physical technology. It's what that technology represents. Once again, it's the medium. The medium is the message. Once again, right? McLuhan, he got it right. He just keeps winning.
Yeah. Patron saint. I'll just say that like the chapter that I've been stuck on in this book, sort of like the final piece of this book that I've been writing, is about neoteny and pedomorphosis and neuroplasticity and the fact that like I'm not like super religious or whatever, but I find that the metaphors encoded in various wisdom traditions are robust for a reason. And there's something about the Gnostic, like the Gospel of Thomas and Jesus saying, you don't enter the kingdom of heaven as an adult, you enter as a child. And, when you think about,
I think he said that in some other places too.
Yeah, he did.
Something like that.
Yeah. This, I'm, like I said, not a Bible scholar, but like,
yeah, no worries, neither am I.
But when you compare human beings to other primates, we're basically sexually mature children. Like we retain this neuroplasticity well into adulthood. And when you look at vertebrates relative to other organisms, again, like the sort of basal chordate is this thing called a sea squirt that has a head and a tail as a larval form, but then eventually settles down and anchors itself to a rock and becomes a filter feeder. And it's about at what point, are you moving from in like child developmental psychology terms, from explore to exploit? Like at what point do you find a stable situation that you can just milk? And so like, I'll share this episode with you too about like, I really believe that this is what's dominating the modern conversation around lifelong learning, because we are at that point where we need to figure out how it is that we remain neuroplastic well into our adulthood and do not become curmudgeons and burnouts in our 30s or 20s, and this is something that I, completely preoccupies me because, I think it, for what it's worth, as somebody like who spends a lot of time in conversations around psychedelics, I think this is why ketamine has become such a hot topic. It's one of the reasons why it seems like this has become so much more visible lately, because it's an NMDA agonist. And so it's actually it's reopening a critical learning window in the brain by like modulating glutamine receptor activity in such a way that the growth of new neuronal connections much more closely resembles what's going on in early childhood or adolescence. And that's why it's so easily utilized for the treatment of depression and trauma, because basically those, as I understand them, those conditions are the brain as a machine learning algorithm overfitting itself to its training data. There's like this, that like you're sort of reopening this like scope of subjective probability or possibility, and allowing something childlike to sort of reestablish itself in your brain, being able to grow out of a trauma. So
yeah, and I think there's a metaphor therapeutic angle to take there too. In the same way that we're talking about metaphors unlocking possibilities, I think we've reached a stage, maybe this has always been true, but the metaphor of skepticism being like the wise thing to do ends up kind of, putting blinders on people and keeping them in their lane epistemically. And something I've been writing and thinking a lot about recently is the risk-benefit analysis of credulity, basically believing everything by default and letting the contradictions sort themselves out. And it seems like, especially in a world where information is super abundant and technology is changing really fast, and there's all kinds of nefarious incentive structures messing with people all the time, the being aware of the whole field of possibilities is way more advantageous than trying to categorically avoid error, which is impossible in the first place. And that's one of the reasons that I really like the risk management metaphor for knowledge so much. That if we're thinking of knowledge, and especially common knowledge, as a risk management problem, we will be surprised less. We will be open to the confirmation of a wider variety of hypotheses. We will have more explanatory power. We'll gravitate toward the explanations that have the greatest explanatory power for all of the information that's out there, not just the favorite or the preferred or the trendy information. And this gives, a lot more resilience and agility and honesty than the sort of, there is one objective truth, these few people decide what it is, and then you must obey kind of model. And I think one of the key things one of the key ways that this aligns with what you're saying is such an approach, like a risk management approach, is founded on the fundamental uncertainty of knowledge and of our understanding of things. There's no pretense that we have the answers. There's hopefully no settling into grooves of neuro-brittleness, you might say. And so I'm excited about the potential of this metaphor of risk management to create a social environment where it's permissible and encouraged to let oneself be more open in that kind of childlike way.
So I got a question for you, if I may.
Oh boy. Oh, please, by all means.
Because, I think I've already established in this conversation that, like if I have a concern about the tokenization of everything, it is that it does seem to emphasize risk mitigation or risk management over fundamental uncertainty.
Interesting.
Over us realizing that, admitting that we don't know how to properly quantize value, and so, like recently when I spoke to the new board chair for SFI, Catherine Collins, who wrote a book about investing through the lens of biomimicry. And she was...
That sounds awesome, by the way.
It is. It's called The Nature of Investing. It's episode 66 of Complexity Podcast. I'll send you the link. She makes this distinction between risk and uncertainty in that, risk is an unknown amount of a known variable. Whereas uncertainty is, are we even using the correct, do we even have the right variables? Are the respective causal contributions properly, formalized or encoded in the way that we're thinking about this in the first place? And so, the issue of fundamental uncertainty, in another conversation that hasn't come out yet on that show with economist Brian Arthur, who, a complete silverback and amazing elder in complexity economics, whose work on the evolution of technology is really inspiring to me. But he wrote this paper recently, Economics and Nouns and Verbs, where he basically says we can't properly model these non-equilibrium adaptive systems with equations because of this issue, because equations are emphasizing that we've laid out the variables, and that basically the shift from sort of 19th century science to complex system science with that pays its full respects to this fundamental uncertainty is a shift into algorithms, which is why you don't get deterministic kind of mathematical models that fully, and that you can, you're dealing with these chaotic and complex dynamics that you just have to run the simulation, and then the simulation comes out in a weird way, so you tweak the parameters of the simulation. And so it's more about it's a philosophical shift from sort of an object-based philosophy to a process philosophy. And so I don't know, I'm just curious for you how you think about that, and what ways, if any, we can kind of use what you're building, or more broadly, use the affordances of Web3 to actually start addressing things at that level. Yeah.
I love the distinction between object-based and process-based philosophy. That's occurred to me a little bit, and I think that's absolutely the right direction to go, because the linearity of object-based philosophy creates Gödel's incompleteness theorem and things like that. It makes it so that we can't have coherence, and then the incoherent things just clash, and then you have intractable problems. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently is that stories are more like the fundamental units of understanding, and that they can be tautological without being nonsensical. And when you're in a story, you can fit any data into that story in a certain role. And so it's really the stories that we tell about the world that we're in, or whatever the case may be, that brings meaning and significance or lack thereof, that brings priorities to the raw information that we get. And by focusing on the raw information, there's sort of this implication that the story will force itself upon you from the information. No, it won't. There's going to be some, precedent that we might inherit that creates a story for us, or there might be a story imposed on us or between competitors for our attention or predictability or whatever. But the data is never going to impose a story. And so the process-based philosophy, I think, is a key shift to make. And it's too complicated to just be advocating for, like, hey, you should become a process-based philosopher. I think we have to build the infrastructure that makes that the default assumption without requiring any effort on people's behalf. And I still like markets for this, because when investors are competing, when they're placing bets, what they're really doing is placing a hypothesis on a story. Because in general, especially in the internet age, all the investors in a certain asset class or asset have access to the same information. And the differences in people's beliefs about it is which story arc that information lies on, what it means. So ultimately, all kinds of investing in markets and trading seem to be proxies for betting on stories. We use the price of oil, we bet on the price of oil in a way that implies something about what its current price means about where it's going to be. And when we talk about fundamental value, well, fundamental value comes from the story we tell about the data that we have. So Ideamarket, I'm hoping, can take this to a one level more meta, one level more abstract, where we're sort of betting on the storytellers and the stories themselves directly without using assets as a proxy.
James?
Well, I'm behind Ideamarket. My boss is right here, so I can't say anything bad, right?
Yeah, I have my goon behind your door there. Did that make sense, or was that just super weird and abstract?
No, I mean, I tend to think that it's sort of like we were talking about earlier with respect to, recognizing brands through color or something, that like story does seem to be the fundament of human cognition, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the way I would kind of try to rephrase what you just said in my own, not my language, but like the language I use, is that we organize our lives through story.
Yeah, story is the active ingredient in epistemology, I think. Like, we think it's data, but it's actually, that's the thing that makes the actual difference. And
right. And so like, for example, SFI external professor Danny Bassett at, where is she? I forget. Anyway, Danielle Bassett talks about, she gave this talk called Networks Thinking Themselves. And she was the one who introduced me to this notion that narrative is the way that we encode a least effort path through a complex network.
Yeah.
And it's like, that like there is, that there may be a million different ways to learn a particular curriculum ultimately. And so like on some level, I remember, actually Terence McKenna wrote about this in his essay on Philip K. Dick, where he was like, as storytellers, we have to create a beginning, a middle, and an end. But, we know that on some level, that's not the way the world actually is, but that's how we convey this to one another, because, there is like water can run a million different ways down a mountain, but there's going to be one way where it's not like where it's sort of running uphill the least, and so like in that sense, we are trained to recognize and identify stories. And like Tyson Yunkaporta, who I recently had on Future Fossils, who runs the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab at Deakin University in Australia, did some recent research on memory techniques used by Australian Aboriginals and comparing the narrative compression of memory in a landscape, a story that you tell about a path through a landscape, and how that differs from, and appears to be in their preliminary results, a superior way to encode information to the comparable Western approach, which is the memory palace, which is this, it's similar in some respects, where you're imagining this enormous architecture in which you assign a particular piece of information to a particular room or an object in the room in your imagination. And like people are capable of memorizing the Old Testament like this. But probably the best memory artists in the West were actually we're cutting a path through that palace. We're telling a story about how they navigate that blueprint, and not just like dropping themselves in there without some sort of vector to traverse. So in that respect, yes, I think that, there's this, we have to hold this sort of dual understanding that the information is fundamental, but the story is also fundamental.
Yeah. You could even say we've always had infinite information. Like when we were just walking around in nature, we could have decided that, this particular blade of grass was really, really important. And we could have decided to orient by a variety of different things. There's palm reading and tea leaf reading and astrology and stuff like that. I actually don't think that's bunk. It's just people are deciding to orient toward meaning as reflected in different like chaotic things. I think there's some merit in a certain way to all those things because the universe is weird and kooky and holographic like that. But I think the point is narrative is the essence of curation in a way that can't really be avoided, because narratives decide what's important and what's not without any extra effort. And there's no point in our lives when that's not the case.
So actually there's, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, before you were talking, it was on mute. I was just going to say you're on mute. It's cool.
Oh yeah. No, I was going to say, I brought up the tarot once on Complexity podcast and got my knuckles slapped for it. But in arguing the merits of thinking about things in precisely the way that you just described, I found this paper in MDPI, which is in Entropy Journal, which is a legitimate, right, an esteemed information theoretical peer-reviewed journal called Information and Signs: The Language of Images by Ina Semetsky at the University of Newcastle. Again, I don't know what it is about Australians, but the antipodal folks don't seem to have the same kind of problem as us Northerners for some reason. But it was about the tarot and information encoded in the tarot and how this she says, at the level of our real experiences, we say that we step in the experiential life world and by means of information processing begin to understand the meanings of this and subsequent experiences. We become wiser and our consciousness expands to accommodate and realize that which presented itself as just invisible information. Citing Lloyd, it is nothing wrong with beginning from nothing. For example, the positive numbers begin from 0. Indeed, the fool is followed by the picture indicating the Roman numeral 1 and the magician, etc. So like there are people out there that, that recognize that these tools, while they may not fit again within the story, the narrative of modernity and its expulsion of the irrational. They're coming back to the way that these cognitive adjuncts did in fact encode meaningful information in sort of, pre-modern decision-making processes. And I think that, that's you're seeing the exact same thing happen in the way that, science is coming back to finding, quantitative justification for indigenous land management practices or folk medical traditions, or, it's just, it's hilarious to me in a way because, it's the same thing around the neuroscience of like realizing that you become consciously aware of a decision after you've already made it. And so in a way, I think that that's really what the sort of the conscious realm of, scientific modernism, that's the relationship it has to this much, much broader base of human understanding, is that it's constantly behind the curve, actually, in as much as that what it does is merely formalize and make more sort of legible or interoperable within a given context these things that require work to sort of justify to a modern mind, but are nonetheless intelligent in their own right. And this is just as an aside, I think that this is where we can sort of square the circle of evolutionary theory and intelligent design. It's like there is an intelligence here. There's landscape agency. There's material agency. There's the distributed nested cognition of evolutionary agents. Looking at work of people like Michael Levin at Tufts, and so I think it's just, in a way, the modern project is actually just, in my opinion, and this is like completely heretical to some people, but I think it really is just sort of like finding a way to substantiate, bolster, and like support for a broader swath of perspectives that which is already the case. But yeah.
I was going to say, you mentioned the tarot, and whenever people mention the tarot, I sort of like to Albert.
Actually, okay. I want to comment on something more boring before and then I want to open up that rabbit hole. Is that okay, James?
Okay.
And I'm really glad, like this is me sort of like coaxing you out onto the dance floor, James. I want your occult authority here.
All right. Well, I feel obligated to, disappoint people for a couple seconds while I talk about something abstract. And the idea of formalizing something that has already in some way been known by, people in different cultures in different ways, and just kind of trying to give it a universal language, I think is one of the potentially big contributions of modern science, that it was not so much discovering things for the first time, but systematizing the organization of knowledge in such a way that when a discovery was made, it could be instantly distributed to people who speak the same language. It was like a language for taking sort of for doing what Ideamarket wants to do, which is taking discoveries from the individual and immediately like Borging that knowledge into the collective, because they all speak the same language. Oh, I'm so glad to get that reference. The end.
You lose a lot in the establishment of standards too. It's worth noting. Like you lose.
Yes.
It's not. Yeah. It's not a purely, normative positive, I guess.
Right. There's a lot of implied ontology that then has big tail costs, and absolutely. And I think that's the wall that we're running into now, that we've kind of accrued so much epistemic debt that now we're like running into this wall where our expectations used to lead. And there, some things need revision now, that this systemization of knowledge is not as useful as it used to be, and we have to graduate from it.
Right. Or like my buddy Gordon Brander just wrote a piece on how it's the tension between creativity and convenience. Like we can't make everything too convenient, or we lose that possibility. It again, back to sort of like getting prematurely old rather than like, staying plastic. But yeah, James, please jump on my.
I could tie loads of threads together here, right? Because there's a problem. I think, Mike, we've sort of come up against somewhat in Ideamarket, even though Ideamarket sort of acts as a function, and especially with a lot of people who are venturing into epistemic questions, right? Is they don't before they start, they don't deal with their own bias. Like before people, if we began from like the Socratic principle of like, you need to know yourself. A lot of people assign things to themselves, which they don't actually have before they seek to know themselves, right? So you begin from this place where you already have a motivated reasoning or a motivated bias, or something is already there, which you're so oblivious to before you even begin your like epistemic, escapades out. And then the problem is you get to a wall where there's just a hypocrisy or there's a paradox, which there is no surmounting. So you either ignore it and you like try retreat to comfort or find some way to reason it out, or like you just have to, the whole thing collapses, right? It just doesn't work. Or the real dangerous thing, you just keep going, right? And you like, it's still there. So anyway, to bring this back to the tarot and the whole thing that sort of happened there that I always comment is like with the tarot and astrology, these days, if someone says like, if someone basically says to me, if I went on a date and they were like, what's your star sign? I just leave, right? Because I'm like, it basically means you've read all the way to the back of the television magazine. So not only are you into modern astrology, you also watch TV, which is like two awful things in one, right? But modern astrology is basically Barnum statements, right? That's the problem. It's like, on Tuesday, you'll do something creative, right? These statements which just apply so loosely, and you read them, you're like, oh, wow. Like you sort of say these things to people, or like pickup artists use them a lot to pick up women, actually. Just to give an example, one is, you're the kind of person who like never got the opportunity to be as creative as you could be. It's like, what does that even mean? It's these statements which just apply to everything. Anyway, my point being is that actually astrology and the tarot were really modernized. And these are things which are about figuring out what's going to happen in the future, right? They were completely modernized. And I grew up with a grandparent who knew how to read the tarot, and everyone always goes, she'll never tell you anything bad. And I was like, this kind of sucks. Like, I kind of want to really know the bad stuff. Like, if the future's always good, then I'm not worried about it. And this whole exercise is useless, because what's the point in it, right? The same with astrology. There's never anything bad. It's always like, this sign's doing this, and there might be some. Point being, anyway, that before they got modernized, your natal chart and your tarot readings, these were brutal. They were like, yeah, you've done your natal chart. Guess what? Your life's going to be really boring. It's going to suck, and you're going to die at like 40. And we know that, right? And whether or not you believe in these things or not, the point was, you wanted epistemology? You wanted an epistemic thing? Yeah, we've got it. We did it. And guess what? Like, it's not always in your favor, by the way. We've got the data. Your life's going to suck. You really shouldn't have asked us to do this. And then it was just after the Victorian era, because the Victorians were like, give it to me straight, like hit me as hard as you can. And then after that era, people wanted more like, oh God, I didn't really want to know that. Can we soften the blow? And then it turned into this sort of industry of basically an epistemology of comfort. You go somewhere, give someone a bit of money, basically the equivalent of modern education. I'm paying you for a degree, therefore I should get the degree at the end. And that value proposition alters the whole arrangement. Like, you can't be a customer of truth. That's what I'd say. You can't be a customer of truth. You can't, because as soon as there's this like indebtedness, you feel you're owed something, but truth doesn't owe you anything. Truth owes you jack.
Yeah, actually, that's related, I think, to weave that back into the issue of prediction markets. That seems related to me to this plague that has taken over at least American politics, of regarding, at some point there was a bait and switch, and we swapped out the notion of the citizen for the notion of the consumer. And so we're no longer, that we're electing people that are basically selling us on a particular story.
I know exactly when this was, by the way, or I have a theory about it, but okay. So one of my favorite documentaries is Century of the Self. It's kind of required homework for all of my friends. Oh yeah, absolutely. So I will recount what you certainly already know in that case, which is when, I guess between World War I and II, when American life started to be generally satisfied. We generally had the tools that we needed. It's no longer about like, here's shampoo because you don't have shampoo. Like when marketing switched from that to everyone has shampoo, how do we keep selling shampoo? It became about selling desire, selling wants, selling preferences, selling self-expression, rather than selling to meet critical needs. And this was all completely engineered and designed and scientifically tested and developed. And the efforts were led by the nephew of Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays, who I hope many of my listeners know. And if not, look that man up because his influence on history is absolutely critical. And the paradigm switched from citizens to consumers in that sense because the corporate mechanisms needed to find ways to continue selling the things that they now had an incredible opportunity to produce. And so America kind of switched from a state where it's about governance and citizenship and rights to something more like a farm, where it's about optimization of yield and what can we extract from the public and how can we optimize to make them produce that as much as we can and resist the harvest as much as we, or not resist the harvest, acquiesce to the harvest as much as we can. And I think we're kind of reaching the breaking point of that now, that, the farming has gone from money on consumerist objects, buying dresses and cars and makeup and things like that, to farming attention. And we're really becoming aware of that being the dominant model now, and all of the hidden costs of optimizing for farming attention in this really sort of deceptive and thieving sort of a way, and sort of mind hacking, this sort of mimetic engineering sort of way, that we are basically being designed as a society to cough up our attention at the slightest provocation and to be easily harvested for our attention. And that's what Ideamarket is trying to experiment with, inoculating ourselves against as a society.
So there's an essay or an article that comes to mind that seems like it exists kind of at the center of the network of everything we've been talking about today, which is a piece that two SFI folks last year, Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin, wrote for Vox EU, called The Coming Battle for the COVID-19 Narrative. And so this is, I'll send you this. This is, Sam Bowles is a sort of famous leftist economist who wrote the Moral Economy, and he wrote I forget the name of it, Schooling in America, I think, with Herbert Gentis, which was a takedown of the way that the American educational system serves these sort of capitalist power structures, and he has also contributed in a key way to this new project, Core Econ, which is an open platform introductory economics courseware that recenters the economics conversation on like values that actually matter, and on like how people actually think about this, rather than sort of the way that we're taught to think about it in Economics 101. And a lot of his work centers on the fact that incentive structures do not necessarily guarantee moral behavior. because like as in a more recent work, he's shown, that, you get these sort of blowbacks where by incentivizing something, you're actually decentering someone's accountability or like sense of moral participation in something. And so, the problem, beyond the problem of simply, using like gamifying politics in the way that we're talking about here, and trying to like capture value and attention and so on. He wrote this piece with Wendy Carlin that talks about how traditionally policy is considered, or like social dynamics are considered on this, the spectrum between the market and the state. And he's like, actually, it's a 3-pole system with the market, the state, and what you might think of as sort of what they call civil society, which is like mutual aid networks, organ donation, neighborhood politics, the church, the rugby club, this mesoscopic level that has been eroded by both state power and market power over the last several centuries. Like I talked about this with Tyson Yunkaporta, and we kind of both looked back. Joseph Henrich has this book, The Weirdest People in the World, that makes the case that it was actually marital taboos instantiated by the Pope, where they said you have to marry outside of your community, and as a way of breaking up like tribal and clan structure so as to harvest value more effectively from individuals. And that, Henrich's got this whole argument for like why it is that this is actually so powerful in terms of like why the West has conquered the world, because to break up stuff on this level, it actually like opens up this whole new economy of scale and so on. But, what Bowles and Carlin are arguing is that, COVID has made clear that not all problems can be solved by the market or by state power. And that, in fact, like as soon as all the businesses are closed and, people can't go to church and something, we suddenly realize that this, what was at least at one time, the major locus of governance among human beings has been entirely outboarded to those two domains. And that, that as this thing, grows to a point that it begins to undermine itself and break down, that suddenly the family level and the neighborhood level and the community level of governance become so obviously important and undernourished in this. And that, the real, basically that civil society, which is not motivated by profit, nor is it motivated by coercion, is actually like the way that we have to address. It's like the layer at which we have to address a lot of these predicaments, and that they are predicaments because we have forgotten, because we've been like, attacked and gaslit for centuries, that like this is actually where this locus of power has to be restored. And I think a lot of people in the crypto world are going to agree with this in as much as they're like, yeah, finally we're capable of generational wealth again. We're capable of wealth that's like held by a family rather than, by people with, the custodianship of institutions, et cetera. And what this means for prediction markets, I'm not really sure. But I mean, I think it's this, just to sort of like tie a bow on comments I made at the beginning of this conversation about how a lot of what really matters in this world cannot be quantified. I think this is kind of where it hits the street level,
Yeah, absolutely. And the impossibility of quantification is why Ideamarket refrains from defining things on other people's behalf to the greatest extent that we can. And I think prediction markets have a severe limitation in that in order to settle a yes or no question, you have to define what yes and no mean and who decides and all of that. Like you can't go into the narrative realm in a prediction market. They're completely up in the data realm. And so Ideamarket is addressing the narrative aspect of information markets. So there is that major difference there. And I wanted to comment on something else that's really interesting that you said about incentives not guaranteeing moral behavior. Absolutely. I think there's just at the definitional level, it's impossible for incentives to guarantee moral behavior because it's impossible for anything to guarantee moral behavior because moral behavior by definition is voluntary. You have to have a choice to be immoral before you can choose to be moral. There's no guarantee of moral behavior. But what incentives can do is make moral behavior seem more or less eminently reasonable. You can make moral behavior be the obvious reasonable choice, or you can make it look absurd. And when incentives and what I'm calling now, epistemic debt or philosophical debt accrues to a society that's built massive things on structures with inevitable philosophical flaws that have gone too long without being questioned, moral behavior starts to look absurd. And that's kind of where we're at now with the way politicians and institutions are handling crises now, is that whatever incentive structures they're embroiled in is making moral behavior like honesty and democracy look absurd to them. And we're paying the cost for that. I'll leave it there.
That's solid. Agreed. It's amazing. Like that's the sad thing about DC, right? Is that you get all these people that come in with these really noble motivations, and then once they're like in the system working as politicians, they're just cynical. And so that gets back to the question of, the way forward actually being backwards, in as much as, in order to solve these problems, we have to escape from the misapplied optimization function that makes it so that you're like, oh, well, what is the point here? The point is to succeed in politics. It's like, no, actually.
The thing is, it sort of goes back to something I mentioned on the one previous podcast. In that sort of oligarchic structure, those at the top who are reaping a ton of material and social benefits basically have constructed that, and the system constructs itself organically to filter for complacency. The higher you get up this thing, it basically proves you have been complacent and you have sunk more cost into the system. So the higher up they are, these people are more likely to be like, no, this guy's not coming up because he's going to shake things up, which means my lovely life is potentially ruined. So, the people in charge, it's just built for that way, which is exactly why the people at the start go, oh, yeah, this guy's so radical. And everyone above him's going, now that's cool. And I like your ideas, but, I want another swimming pool next week. So what is their incentive what is their personal incentive to have this guy on board? And, and that the thing is with that structure is basically the same structure of how you get people to do things which they would never normally do. And you find it even in retail stores, which have a managerial structure, is that question of why is this assistant manager who's getting $15 an hour such a horrible person? And it's for that exact same reason that they have, from that position, been sort of built into complacency, and that their modicum of life stability rests on them not shaking things up in the store I think that whole oligarchic structure just goes across everything, right? It's the managerial state. It's really hard to to sort of penetrate because it's built to not be shaken up.
These are the reasons why you do not want to hire me, right? This is the reason that I'm amazed I've ever held a job.
Is that what you'd say in your job interview? What are your weaknesses? I'll probably ruin your entire company.
Yeah, but in a good way.
Good way.
I mean, I think, again, like the people that are going to flourish in a metamorphic economy or, a kind of turbulent transitional period of history are the people that are going to welcome dissent, that are going to, practice this humility. And yet, it gets back to this issue of like, how do these systems aggregate information across timescales in such a way as to acknowledge that this is necessary? Some of them are just going to fall to this. Some of them are not going to be able to respond with the agility required to even acknowledge that you want a red team inside your organization. And so, I mean, this is, I think I've been more or less unemployable for my entire life, but I have hope, looking out at everything that's being built these days, that, that me and people like me, the generalists and the raconteurs and the, the Ian Malcolms of the world are finally going to have, are going to be folded and folded into this structure in a way, our value will be captured. We will be co-opted and commodified. And like, look, I mean, that's not entirely bad. It means I get to feed my kids, so, sort of like, eat me.
I see it. Well, I mean, that is a perfect place for a mic drop, but, I don't know. I want to see if I could frame that in a hopeful way that I think it really deserves. In that there's, I think it is a Bible story. The idea that like a little bit of leaven can make a whole loaf of bread rise. And I think that's kind of the role that, really sound philosophical examination and red teaming can do for the infrastructure that's being built right now. Because for every little improvement that can be made, the speed and gravity of the inevitable problems that it creates are going to be much, much more manageable. So I hope that crypto people especially recognize that and make sure that you become eminently employable in all the right ways.
Or, to put it the way I did in Complexity episode 42, every court needs a fool.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Love that.
That's why it's card zero, because it's fundamental. You need somebody there to see things differently.
Yeah. And I would definitely welcome that. I actually just started, as a result of, the conversation with Buster Benson, who wrote The Art of Productive Disagreement, about his experiences, in companies, encouraging honest, difficult conversation and red teaming and stuff. I just started a red team channel in the Ideamarket Discord specifically for having an outlet for that stuff. So I'd love to have you come in and critique everything and tell us why we're idiots.
Red team, the red team. Sure.
Well, I'm by default the blue team. I have an agenda, but yeah, please, bring it on. I think that's awesome. And you're clearly are thinking about this stuff a lot in ways that I think are really great. And this conversation has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. I'd like to return the invitation and get you on Future Fossils sometime to state your case and James to draw you out a little further into your strengths as a scholar and practitioner of the truly weird shit.
I don't practice the real weird stuff anymore.
It's because you're too good of a scholar of it. You know better than to practice it.
Yeah, no. we can discuss it after we've finished up there. Are we so this? Are we done?
We're good. I'm fine to leave
Okay.
it rolling or cut it off, whatever you prefer.
It seems a pretty natural stop. Michael Garfield, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you.